Welcome to this presentation on governing complex emergencies. My name is Philipp Rode. I'm the Executive Director of LSE Cities at the London School of Economics and the LSE lead for the Emergency Governance Initiative. That's an initiative by LSE Cities at the London School of Economics in partnership with UCLG and Metropolis. We are very much looking forward to building bridges and connections with existing work and ongoing initiatives and are really delighted to be part of the GPDRR event this year and look forward to engaging with you. This presentation brings us to a specific subcategory of governance, or indeed urban governance, which may over the next decade in many ways, unfortunately, receive increasing prominence. And it's the governance of complex emergencies. This is a subject which, of course, we are all pretty familiar with as a consequence of the recent global pandemic. But there are other areas and other concerns, certainly the climate emergency, but also a whole range of social emergencies, which now beg the question, how do our institutional structures, how do our governance regimes, including those of cities and regions, actually respond to this new, maybe far more dramatic need for rapid and radical intervention? 2015 and 16 were critical years for the global community, defining a range of very influential global agendas. We are all too familiar with all three of those. On the very left, the Sustainable Development Goals, at the center, the Paris Agreement, and on the right, the New Urban Agenda. And reflecting on how far has the global community been able to respond to the ambitions in these documents is, of course, very important as we enter the 2020s. And here there is a prominent observation that the broad ambition of really cutting across targets and objectives and outcomes as they are represented by the different SDGs is not just incredibly difficult to bring together, but each of these goals taken by themselves is incredibly ambitious, and in many instances the global community with the partner cities and countries have been struggling to really deliver according to plan, according to setting in pace motions that will be able to deliver outcomes by the year 2030. And on top of that, we are having not just the top three real disruptive forces of the climate emergency, social justice crises, and COVID-19. We are seeing technological disruption. We are seeing the long tail of financial crises. We're seeing a new populism, austerity measures, a whole range of sort of more unilateral initiatives no longer connecting the dots across different regions and nations that make it even more complicated to address the broad goals that were set. And that dilemma of, on the one hand, having a big agenda, an ambitious agenda, also a positive agenda for change, and on the other hand, institutions that are struggling to cope is, of course, an incredibly frustrating experience. We may even want to go as far as to simply conclude, as we are in the early 2020s, to suggest that our institutions are too slow to achieve the targets that were set, too weak to balance the vested interests, and ultimately too disconnected from the electorate, from the people that give us the legitimacy to change, to have ultimately the power to go about with the dramatic and radical changes required. Essentially, what we are witnessing here is that many of the grand challenges or the ambitions of the SDG, of the Paris Agreement, are being reframed as complex emergencies. And that terminological change is actually quite important to appreciate from an institutional and a governance perspective. Before we get there, the important reminder that, of course, a more conventional form of thinking about emergencies, which first of all highlight that there are a whole range of routine emergencies and non-routine emergencies like natural disasters or human-enhanced natural disasters. There are also existing human-made disasters. All of them have actually been leading to very precise protocols of how states, cities, regions respond to those type of areas where you would have to very radically and very quickly respond. Now that's quite different if you then move to the right side of these complex emergencies, whether they are global complex emergencies like the one related to climate and ecology, or the one related to health, and otherwise also more maybe regional complex emergencies around social concerns. All of these share a couple of very important characteristics that differentiate them from the usual mix of, broadly speaking, very hands-on and very tangible emergencies that are very short-term in many instances. So these complex emergencies, and this will have been discussed a few times before, are of course far more political in nature. They often go far beyond what is the social and political memory of specific locales, and then they share a range of other key characteristics which, when we think about the governance, we must absolutely appreciate. Declaring complex emergencies as such is a fact. It has happened in many of the instances and types I have already referred to. Maybe most prominent for local and regional governments is the declaration of a climate emergency. By the end of 2020, more than 820 million residents live in jurisdictions across 33 different countries that have declared such an emergency. And that in itself, of course, leads to interesting question, what is then precisely happening in those contexts, in those jurisdictions, and how can they learn from each other? Talking about learning, not just from each other, but also from the past, I already mentioned when it comes to the more conventional, whether routine or non-routine emergency cities and regions have developed quite sophisticated mechanisms. This is the case of Rio de Janeiro, the Command and Response Center that was set up after one of the key flood events there, bringing together different types of city administrations, allowing the mayor to operate as sort of a lead executive to help responding to the emergency in one locale, in one location where a lot of information is being centralized. That is an example of still dealing with, let's call them, nevertheless, conventional emergencies. When we are moving into the complex end of the spectrum, where things become more political, there's very nascent experience around new forms of assemblies being set up, or new commissions, also new offices. Some cities have been experimenting with that. This happens to be the case of the Climate Assembly in the London Borough of Camden, one of those experiments that tries to bring together quite diverse voices, representative of the local community, that then is presented with the facts and the figures and collectively works through a process, a very transparent process of teasing out the solutions that could be put forward as part of a more formal policy engagement at that borough level. This is very helpful potentially for the executive decision makers to then have greater legitimacy for their actions, and is also helpful to ensure that there's a greater variety of options being developed. In the end, quite a lot of these assemblies have shown that residents are able to find a new consensus, or at least a large majority is coming together behind certain actions, and that in itself is of course an important learning process and a collective action process. Now, regardless, we need to recognize that there is little experience, knowledge, and exchange on governing complex emergencies, and that in itself is an important point of departure to then think a bit more about how can it be framed, how can it be conceptualized, and then ultimately how can we develop concrete tools and ways forward that may be capable reflecting the scale of the ambition. I now want to present a few empirical findings around governance challenges and changes as they relate to complex emergencies. And these are almost exclusively coming out of the pandemic and related insights from city governments around the world. The first overview here is looking at political governance challenges and how they played out during the pandemic. The most important ones here were referred to as lack of municipal autonomy, politicization of emergency powers, the underrepresentation of women, ethnic minorities, and or vulnerable groups, and low levels of compliance with laws and regulation. So these follow sort of the extremely challenging path to a greater degree than a few others which are further down on this overview. There are also a range of administrative, more technocratic governance challenges. The highest here, unsurprising, insufficient public budgets, uncertainty about funding, also related, of course, to the financing situation. The difficulty of working across different tiers of government, a coordination problem, so is the complexity and interdependency of policy sectors impacting the crises. So we're already getting here a sense of where the real innovation needs to be, where the real contributions of better institutional frameworks need to really make a difference in order to allow local governments in particular to respond better to those complex emergencies. This overview looks at the shifting expenditure priorities and compares those budget items that have been deprioritized in gray on the right with those in red on the left, which received priority investments and spending. Not surprising, you have a lot of new expenses related to health and hygiene, also to public services, human resources, and so on. And the biggest cuts and reductions, culture and arts, sport as well, public works, and then infrastructure investments. That's where the money was saved. Now moving on into where innovation takes place, a moment of crisis, always a moment where real new thinking is employed and where also the new practices are being tested. This is really capturing where cities have been highly innovative or where at least a degree of innovation is taking place across the board, quite a considerable degree of experimenting with new things. But when it comes to authority and leadership, reinventing leadership at a time of crisis, a lot of cities report back that that's something they have been successfully experimenting with. The cooperation and collaboration across key stakeholders, information technology and data management. These are the top three which really resonated most in terms of new practices. So what governance change is then also emerging as part of these experiences. There are big questions about the distribution of power across different tiers of government. Who is best equipped to lead what kind of initiative, what kind of policy, what kind of emergency response? Another question of asking this is who has the best opportunity to deal with trade-offs? Who is best equipped to really be able to push through quite difficult policies at these moments of crises? And there are many that would argue that local government, regional government has a particular opportunity in specific domains. A separate question, which is also part of a multi-level governance understanding of an emergency response, is how the vertical coordination takes place. How do cities, regions report back to the national or state level and are part of a strategic engagement rather than just being the implementing agents on the ground? And that, of course, is a separate question from the initial redistribution of authority. We have looked at the distribution of sort of leadership across sectors before. This is really a reminder that when it comes to multi-level governance, even the responsibility in relation to who is taking the lead for these key sectors within government and across different tiers of government is probably changing. And here the central question is about the degree to which we'll see decentralization and devolution continuing in specific sectors, or a form of centralization and nationalization taking hold. These are quite important fundamental urban governance questions that need to be much better understood. The last perspective I'd like to share with you under the spanner of governing complex emergencies are some emerging key principles. This again is where the Emergency Governance Initiative currently stands, what is currently being tested. These are not entirely matured and signed off paradigms, but this is at least where a conversation has started. And some of them, of course, build on the very important foundational work on new urban governance more generally. But when we shift to emergency, the first thing that is important to appreciate the degree to which the governments are in the driving seat. And then second, and very much in relation to the first, the degree to which human rights and social justice need to be reflected and receive utmost attention. This is, of course, where considerable potential for abuse may exist. The third point is the importance of discovering, exploring, inventing new forms of democratic legitimacy. This may be in relation to new types of commissions or indeed climate assemblies, which can be then transferred and translated to the idea of emergency assemblies and commissions, which support the executive with a more inclusive format of decision making. The fourth point may be among the more innovative components, the idea of governance by empathy, to ensure that collaboration, co-creation, and caring is part of the emergency response. Caring in itself as a very foundational logic of how governments should ideally engage with citizens is relatively new. It's also informed by an interesting feminist critique, and there are leaders, world leaders and urban leaders that have taken on this idea quite directly. And a lot comes down to being able to empathize with the people you're working for and to make connections to those struggles in their daily lives and acknowledge those difficulties. And at the same time also acknowledge that government itself exists of humans that are making mistakes, and that these mistakes need to be openly communicated alongside. Truth-telling and acknowledging the scale of the problem is certainly a critical component at a point where a crisis or the emergency may not be visible. This relies on good science that is translated to communication efforts, but it also requires to tackle the social media tendencies of distorting truths, of even providing untruths to large proportions of the society. That needs to be directly addressed and counterbalanced by efforts and new collections of actors that work together as part of this effort of truth-telling. Embrace a systems approach is a more general issue that, of course, in urban context we all know too much about. We cannot break down the urban system into just a transport or a building or an energy component. These need to be thought together and then fully integrated with also the many different social sectors. Emergency governance requires hybridity, bringing together hierarchies and networks, a key lesson that we're also learning through integrated governance. It is not a good idea to either roll out one or the other. Multi-level emergency governance can build on existing frameworks, but must go far beyond that and really invent new types of coordination across the vertical axes. We need to differentiate planning and implementation roles, but not fall into this trap of simply associating one tier of government with either an implementation or a strategic planning exercise. And finally, of course, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. These ideas around how emergency governance should maybe operate may be quite generic initially and then need to be translated to very specific cultural, political, and geographic contexts.